Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is David Garza. I am the president and CEO of Henry Street Settlement. I'm really honored and grateful to be here with everyone. Welcome to Henry Street Settlement's 7th annual Lillian Wald Symposium. Every year, we frame up an important topic. I'm excited for tonight's topic, and I'll get to introduce it right now. But I'm parked outside of one of Henry Street's sites here on the Lower East Side. And every Henry Street meeting that we have or gathering that we have, we make sure that we pay homage to those that were here before us. And so Henry Street Settlement is literally situated on the Lenape Island of Manhattan, or Mannahatta, in the Lenape homeland. And so we pay respect and homage to people past, present, and future for their continuing presence here on the Lower East Side in their homeland and throughout the Lenape diaspora. We offer our care and our gratitude to the land, to the water, and to the air, and we try to be good stewards to our neighborhood, because as a Henry Street Settlement, we're a place-based operation. So our place and our home is very important to us, and we honor it accordingly. So thank you for welcoming this event to this space. Henry Street Settlement's mission is to open doors of opportunity for Lower East Side residents and all New Yorkers through social services, the arts, and healthcare programs. At 129 years old and counting and going strong, we continue to champion our founder, Lillian Wald, and her blueprint for social change. She believed that to make change, you need to bring people together from all perspectives, from all walks of life, and listen to their needs, to their ideas and their solutions. And tonight's conversation reflects that ethos that we have of bringing people together and coming around a table, whether it's virtual or real. So welcome all of you tonight to our table. The annual Lillian Wald Symposium is one way that we do that. We bring people around a topic. And each year we hold up and wrestle with a topic that's central to our history, but also to our present day work. Just like Lillian Wald did with visitors who came from around the world to discuss public health, civil rights, and ways to fight poverty and help make better lives for our neighbors. Tonight's topic is really important, and it's especially important in New York City. Tonight's topic is, what is a living wage? What lifts people out of poverty? How is that lifting people out of poverty embedded in Henry Street's DNA, as it has been since the beginning of our existence and the beginning of our mission? Lifting people out of poverty touches everything we do, whether it's helping people get a job, overcome educational deficits, avoiding homelessness and staying healthy, access to the arts. These are all ways to enrich people's lives and help open a door of opportunity, as opposed to being oppressed or trapped in poverty. In recent years, many institutions have tried to estimate what is a real living wage as opposed to a minimum wage. What is the amount of dollars that people need to meet their basic needs? There is no perfect number, but we certainly know that $15 an hour, which is New York City's minimum wage, is nowhere close to that. And we tonight will explore, what is a living wage? How can people afford to pay rent, afford to put food on the table, afford to pay their electric bill? And what are the forces and what are the variables that help determine that? Right now, the topic of a living wage, there's renewed interest and there's renewed focus. The pandemic has laid raw the disparity in pay of certain classifications of workers versus others. In our cases, human service workers, when everyone else was being told to stay home and shutter behind doors, our human service workers, whether it was delivering food, distributing PPE, working in our homeless shelters, caring for our children, they were being told to come to work. And what became exposed in that analysis and that acknowledgement of our essential workers were that these were among some of the lowest paid workers in our economic classifications. And with that bright light of the pandemic, it also exposed the racial inequalities there and the class disparities there. 2/3 of the people that work in human services are people of color. And so this is an issue of race. This is an issue of class. This is an issue of social justice. And finding ways in our society for people to make a living wage as opposed to a minimum wage, right now it feels very aspirational. And my perspective on it is that it should not be aspirational. This is really about economic justice. This is about equity. This is about fairness. And so tonight's conversation, we're really honored to host it at Henry Street because in addition to the pandemic and the social justice movement and the appropriately sharp focus on race and disparity has brought the conversation to Henry Street's table. And for Henry Street, we embrace that every budget is a moral document. It reflects our values and it reflects what we care about. At Henry Street, it's a moral imperative that we take on this issue. It's about the fact that no one should struggle to make ends meet. It's about food, rent, and the electric bill. It's about not contributing by paying our human service workers poverty wages, while at the same time, we're trying to fight poverty. So not contributing to the very cycle of poverty that we're trying to fight. As stated, it's about anti-racism, it's about equity, and for us, it's about our mission, because if we can pay our human service workers so that they don't come to work anxious, concerned about how to make ends meet, how to put food on the table, we're going to be an organization that's more capable of carrying out our mission. And for Henry Street, for many, many years throughout our history, we've been a thought leader on many issues. And in this issue, we think it's important to be a thought leader, but it's also important to be an action leader. And so that's why I'm really proud, grateful, and fortunate to be able to announce that 2 weeks ago, Henry Street made an important decision that we will no longer tolerate low wages amongst our workers. And we are committed to bringing Henry Street's wage up to at least $22 an hour, which reflects a living wage. We think it's imperative that the government follow suit as an organization that gets 70 to 75% of our wages from city government. It's imperative that city government, state government, federal government pay their workers living wages. So we hope that our commitment to $22 an hour and higher is only the beginning of attention, of focus, of action, and of leadership to make sure that this issue is not only met with advocacy, but that it's also met with action. Why $22 an hour? That's a question that's going to get debated and discussed tonight. For us, Henry Street looked at research institutions like MIT's living wage calculator, like the Economic Policy Institute's family wage calculator, and we made a determination based on Henry Street's configuration that $22 an hour for a single adult was an important step toward equity and toward putting people in a position to make their basic needs. I'm really grateful that we're going to learn so much more about this issue, because our commitment at Henry Street is to keep looking at the issue and not only look at the floor, but look at the rest of the room and look at the other opportunities that might exist. So with that, I welcome all of you again, and I'm really pleased to announce and introduce our moderator for tonight, Paul Sonn. Paul is the State Policy Program Director with the National Employment Law Project. It's one of the organizations that has grappled with this question of what a living wage is and what pay people need to make ends meet. And tonight, Paul will introduce our esteemed panelists in this area. And in your event confirmation, there's included a digital program. So if you go back to the confirmation, you can click on a link and there's full bios for all of our panelists, plus a book of recommended readings on the topic that'll be discussed during tonight's events. So all that contextualized information is provided for you there so that you can focus on the panelists and the conversation tonight. I want to give a special shout out and an acknowledgement and a thank you to the entire team at Henry Street who does this work tirelessly, committed in a committed way, and often without the opportunity to receive the full support they need. Because often, like I explained before, some people are being told to stay in place, and our team is on the front lines delivering services. So my heart is out to them. I acknowledge them. And I want to give a special thank you to our public historian, Katie Vogel, who's the organizer of tonight's event, but also to all of our speakers and all of our guests and all of our extended Henry Street family. And please visit henrystreet.org if you'd like to learn more about us. And this panel will be there to be shared and consumed after this conversation. So grateful to be here. Grateful that all of you are here for this important conversation. Thank you very much. Paul?
Great. Thanks so much, David. I'm Paul Sonn, and it's really such a pleasure to join you and our distinguished panel this evening for a conversation about the idea of a living wage in New York, and to draw insights from Henry Street's visionary founder, Lillian Wald. And it's so fitting to have this conversation right now as you build on on her legacy with this very important announcement that David just shared, that Henry Street will begin paying all its staff a living wage of $22 an hour or more. That is, a tremendous feat for an organization in the chronically underfunded human services sector. And, David and the whole Henry Street team just deserve such credit for their leadership around this. And, I put a special shout out to old friends, Jeremy Reese and Barbara Kanselbaum, and the new members of the Henry Street team that I was been pleased to meet and work with in this evening. So, and this key issue of the human services sector and the kind of the policy challenges and the kind of racial justice issues that it presents is really one of the key facets of the living wage conversation I think we'll delve into this evening we'll hear more about from our expert panel. And with that, I'll briefly introduce our terrific group of speakers. The first, I'll go through all of them and then they'll speak. So the first is Raysa Rodriguez, who's the Chief Program and Policy Officer at the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, which most of you, I'm sure, know. It's a really distinguished anti-poverty agency and network of human services providers in the city. Next is Tsedeye Gebreselassie, who's the Director of the Work Quality Program at the National Employment Law Project, a national workers' rights organization headquartered in New York City, where I'm privileged to be your colleague, where I also work there. Third is Maura Cuffie, who is the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Creatives Rebuild New York, a really, really cool, innovative organization that supports creative strategies to bring living wage jobs to artists in our city and state. And fourth, and our final panelist is Dr. Samir Sonti, who's an assistant professor and historian at CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies and a leading scholar of labor and public policy. As David flagged, please do look at the digital program to read more about their backgrounds. They're really amazing people. And with that, with one piece of housekeeping also, I'll note, throughout the conversations, please, if you have questions, put them in the chat, and then when we get to the Q&A phase, we'll try to tackle as many of them as we have time for. And so with that, I'll kick us off by raising, I was asked to address the question of what exactly is a living wage? And typically it's defined as a paycheck that enables a person to live at a decent standard of living, including to afford adequate food, shelter, and other necessities. And if you do the math of what a basic apartment costs, together with food, transportation, a cell phone, health coverage, and the like, really anywhere in the country, you'll quickly find that what you need to afford the basics is not low. And then here in New York, with ever spiraling rents, the math is harder than anywhere in the United States. And as David explained, the $15 minimum wage, which began in New York and was a really historic step forward in the movement for fair wages, it's just not even close to a living wage. So what does that mean for where our public policy needs to go, for our human services sector, where caregivers, as David explained, the majority of them, women of color, perform vital, grueling work that all of us, from seniors to infants, need, yet themselves can't afford right now to live with dignity in our city, or for artists who make New York a vital hub of creativity, yet who can no longer afford decent housing or life's basics. Can the minimum wage ever be a living wage? What's the roadmap for making New York a livable, vibrant, diverse, humane, racially just city? These are some of the questions our panelists are going to help us talk through. So with that, I will kick it off to our first panelist, Samir Sonti. And so Samir, the historical backdrop to this panel is the innovative work that Lillian Wald, Henry Street's founder, did in the early 20th century to support struggles for economic and racial justice in New York at the time. Can you share with us some of that history to situate our conversation today?
Sure. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Katie, David, everyone at Henry Street for putting this together. It's, I mean, really quite an honor to be at this historic institution. I've done, over the last 2 years, I guess all of us have done a lot of these Zoom sessions, but I have to say this is one where I'm feeling more chills and some nerves, just because of the significance historically of the institution, and to be with such incredible, co-panelists who are doing this work day in, day out. Yeah, I guess, I'm as the sort of academic here, I'll try not to drone on for too long, but maybe to set it up, of course, the world has changed enormously since Lillian Wald's time. And I'm a historian, so I'm not supposed to talk about the present as if the past is directly applicable. But it is the case that a lot of the questions we're confronting right now are the ones that she confronted 100 years ago. We often hear, maybe some in the audience are familiar with the term New Gilded Age, which is used to describe our current times, which are marked by extreme inequality, corporate exploitation of working people, and especially immigrant workers and workers of color, and the enduring legacy of racial injustice. And, the original Gilded Age looked similar. And I think while, Lillian Wald might not recognize the Zoom screen, she would recognize a lot about the world we live in today. And that was a context in which in the late 19th century, she grew up, and when she established Henry Street in 1893, at I think the age of 26, which is extraordinary. Now, New York, it's tough to talk about New York without stressing its exceptionality. And Lillian Wald also was an exceptional person, but she wasn't alone in her efforts at the time. The Henry Street settlement was part of a broad movement for social and economic reform during the period that historians called the Progressive Era, around the turn of the 20th century. And the idea behind settlement houses, which sprang up in industrial cities all over the country, Chicago, Philly, Baltimore, was that reformers would literally settle in communities affected by all of the traumas of industrial capitalism, which was growing up and which was pretty new at that time, to provide services and support organizing efforts of the residents. And, to take the example of Henry Street, this meant, of course, the low income, almost entirely immigrant population of the Lower East Side at the time, largely from Eastern and Southern Europe, which has of course changed over time, but Henry Street continues serving an immigrant low-wage population as it did 100 years ago. It's kind of extraordinary, actually, looking at her biography of where she was. She was a founding member of the NAACP. She was a leader in the women's movement. She was active, for the purposes of our conversation, in a number of worker struggles in the Lower East Side. Garment workers, the garment industry was a big industry in the area at the time, and unions like the LGWU, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, were growing organizations at the time, and it took a lot to take a stand with them when she did, and that legacy, I think, is still very much a part of Henry Street. It's also, I think, important just to kind of set the stage a little bit for what the world looked like in the early 20th century. I mean, this is a time with no labor laws, no employment laws to speak of, no child labor, no minimum wage, no union rights. And people like Lillian Wald and the community of which she was a part struggled for those. Sometimes they succeeded in passing them, and they were pretty quickly struck down by the courts for decades, right? Decade upon decade of struggle, defeat, some progress made. And I think that's just a lesson to learn. I'm 35 years old, and I would say that this is the most exciting time for this struggle in my lifetime. But it's been one of a long slog over the last several decades, and it can feel like we're up against the universe. And that's a real lesson, I think, to take from Wald and Henry Street and the world of which she was a part. All that effort, these progressive era efforts, the early 20th century struggles that Wald was a part of, ultimately did yield fruit in the 1930s with the New Deal, which was the major burst of progressive policy passed in response to the Great Depression. And this is when we got the basic structure of worker protections and labor laws that we still have today. Things like the National Labor Relations Act, which has been in the news a little bit lately, thanks to our friends in Staten Island, the Social Security Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, which finally established a minimum wage, abolished child labor, set hours, regulations, and so on. And these are huge victories that were the culmination of not just the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s, but of decades of struggle from working people and reformers like Lillian Wald going back, a half century before. Now, it's of course important to note that these victories had major limitations as well. In large part, due to the strong power of the racist Southern Democratic Coalition and the Democratic Party at the time. Each of the laws I mentioned, the National Labor Relations Act, Social Security, Fair Labor Standards, and others all excluded agricultural domestic workers who were disproportionately Black workers, disproportionately Black women. And that is a legacy of the reform movement that we have to reckon with. Now, some of this has changed, right? And then in the 1960s and the 1970s, the Fair Labor Standards Act, for instance, was extended to agricultural and domestic workers, but that extension hasn't applied to union rights. And so domestic workers and farm workers today still don't have the right at the federal level to form unions. It's different in certain states, and we can maybe talk about that as well. So I guess, I'll maybe close with that, just noting that Wald was a part of a multi-generational struggle for economic and racial justice that we inherit today. There's been ups and downs along the way. We've suffered many defeats since her time, but we're continuing in the tradition, and my co-panelists are continuing the tradition. And on the one hand, it's sad to say that we're dealing with the same issues that she confronted a century ago. On the other hand, it's just a reminder that the struggle continues forever. So I guess maybe I'll open up with that, and I'll look forward to talking and hearing and learning from all of you, and also all of you in the audience, many of whom are experts on the subject and as practitioners and as scholars and as seasoned veterans of our movement. And so I'm really, really thrilled to be here. Thanks.
Thank you, Samir. And maybe just one quick follow-up on that. When those kind of those progressive era first wave of labor protections were won, and they're built on through the 30s through 50s. Was there ever a period where the minimum wage was a living wage? This issue we're struggling with now.
I think it's important to note that the minimum wage, the idea behind the minimum wage has always been to ensure that employers have a tractable workforce that they can exploit, that it's not too high of a level, where workers have some security. With economic security comes a bit of bargaining power, and that's the last thing that corporate employers want. So, I think the fact of the matter is that the minimum wage has never been a living wage, and that's why a conversation like this is so important, how we can get beyond the discourse of a minimum wage, a floor, and set the terms of debate around what a real living wage is in a time in which the cost of living is rising everywhere, above all in a place like this.
Got it. Thank you, Samir. Well, so maybe with that, we'll pivot to Raysa, and turn back to one of the key questions we flagged earlier, kind of the human services sector. Today, more than a century has passed since Lillian Wald's era of tenement slums. But in today's New York, the same challenges persist with too many New Yorkers not being able to afford a life with dignity in the face of rising rents and living costs. Can you tell us what workers in today's New York need, and whether our current protections, our labor laws and safety net programs and more, are delivering the economic security and mobility that all New Yorkers deserve?
Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you all. And a special thanks to Henry Street. I'm just so excited to be here and humbled for the opportunity to share my perspective in this important conversation. I mean, your roll call, David, starting us off says it all. I live for that roll call, as my kids say, that gave me life. It really speaks to the community, right? That you all have been able to cultivate and sustain and grow. And so I'm just so humbled for the opportunity to be with you and share some space this evening. A little bit about FPWA, if I can, for 10 seconds. FPWA for 100 years has been an anti-poverty policy and advocacy organization. We work to improve the lives of New Yorkers by doing three key things: advocating for policy, providing critical supports to human services organizations, and really providing targeted emergency financial assistance to New Yorkers in need. I wanted to add just a little bit more on the historical context, if I may, as well. When we examine the history of our social welfare system, driven in large parts by critical labor movements, we see time and time again evidence of the fact that our social welfare system and our social welfare benefits by design, are focused on weeding out those who may or those who exploit the system. What I want to impart this evening on all of you is the real need that we need to focus more on really shifting that narrative, right? The fact that the system does most of the exploiting, right? And that is true in our painful history, and it's still true today. To your question, Paul, about what workers need, the answer can be as simple as more expanded and more effective supports. It's impossible to have a conversation about living wage and about what it means to make ends meet in a dignified way without also taking a really careful look at our benefit systems, at all the ways in which they essentially fail us and in the way that they keep individuals, families, and communities in an unbreakable cycle of poverty. So several years ago, FPWA was one of the leaders in the fight for 15 to raise minimum wage, right? And we heard consistently and time again from a range of experts that we needed to be careful, right, with this fight and this effort, that raising the wage and raising minimum wage can result in potential benefit cliffs. You know, the idea or the question around what would happen if we raise wages, what would happen to critical benefits that households rely on? What would be the impact of rising wages on security overall? And so FPWA for several years in response launched a benefit cliffs research project, which culminated in our most recent report, Pushed to the Precipice. And so I encourage you all to kind of visit our website and take a look if you're interested in this research in greater detail. I'll let you know that we partnered with Center for Women's Welfare at the University of Washington to update the self-sufficiency standard for New York, and to really look at the extent that that benefits can move recipients towards wage adequacy. And I'm going to fast forward to a little bit of highlights of what we found, right? The truth is we are in many ways, some ways, not many, I should say, in some ways lucky that in New York, we have some protections, right? Where we have, you know, either phase out or New York State has been able to eliminate some really harmful benefit cliffs. However, we found significant, hurtful, detrimental cliffs in the area of childcare, which essentially results in families who reach 200% of federal poverty level, or just above $43,000 for a family of 3, or slightly above $52,000 for a family of 4, really lose a critical childcare benefit, right? Talk about a necessary work support. We can't talk about what it takes to make ends meet with dignity without crucially addressing the need for high quality childcare for this essential work. The other thing I'll say too is that while we were engaged in this research, you know, we did realize that New York, as I said, has largely addressed a lot of detrimental benefit cliffs in the areas and examples of SNAP benefits and Medicaid. But our research really opened up a rabbit hole, I'm quickly learning, in terms of the many ways that our benefit system falls short in really addressing the true needs of families and households, whether it's through eligibility gaps, through really detrimental administrative burdens and barriers, or whether it's through hardship gaps. Again, our system is not designed to allow for a dignified life. I mean, just this week, I don't know if many of you noticed, just this week, there was news reported of an unacceptable coverage gap in our city's housing voucher, right? And I love this question around dignity, right? We haven't even talked about like, well, what are we defining dignity as? What does it mean to live a life in a dignified manner, right? And so, you know, I'm a very reflective person. And so I often pose the question to myself, and I know that, you know, have resources that many New Yorkers don't have, and consider myself a privileged individual. And, you know, when I kind of consider that hypothetical, I think about the ability to provide a roof over your family's head, right? The ability to make sure that there's food on the table, that you are able to prioritize your child's health without fear of loss of wages, right? And so getting back to this hardship gap on the city's voucher system, we know that there are New Yorkers that are eligible for the city's housing voucher, right? And we know that they've been awarded and granted a voucher and still can't find housing security, right? Cannot find an apartment to ensure that their family is stably housed, all because we've made it so incredibly difficult to access so much of our benefits. And so I encourage us as we continue with this dialogue, to really, consider this dual need to really look at increasing wages, but figuring out what is the way that we need to provide necessary worker supports by strengthening, enhancing, and ensuring that we have greater access to what are critical benefits New Yorkers rely on.
Thank you, Raysa. I mean, you really explained so well how we need both living wages and kind of well-designed benefit systems to go in hand. We need both of them in order to really work together to lift workers and families up to a decent level of living and dignity. On kind of part of the puzzle, the kind of human services sector, where the sector, as you highlighted, that's fighting for economic justice, yet has been underfunded and employs a workforce that itself too often can't live with dignity. Can the city and state afford to pay more? And what's the roadmap for having all of our human services jobs follow the path that Henry Street is leading in towards decent wages?
Thank you, Paul. That's an important question. I'm not going to suggest that I know exactly what the roadmap is, but I can tell you, that what it takes is long-term commitment to really identifying the way to get there, right? And I think, and I definitely want to pause to congratulate Henry Street on making such a bold step, right? We think it's just so critical, so perfect timing, really, to be a leader in terms of what it takes. And so, I think David said it best when he opened up. I'll, in my notes would re-articulate so much of what he said. This is plain and simply a issue of race equity and justice. We need to do this. There is no way that we can be about justice without addressing wage inadequacy in the human services sector, right? And so I find myself constantly, reminding that we need to ask ourselves, and what's the role of government in that, right? Yes, of course, government can't do it alone. The partnerships are incredibly important, but government is the lead, right? And I think it's about priorities. When I was preparing for this important event, I came across, I don't believe in mistakes, right? I believe everything happens for a reason, but I by chance, came across a quote from Nelson Mandela, and I thought it was just so appropriate, right? I found a quote that says, and I hope it's as accurate as possible. You know how quotes can sometimes not be exact, but poverty is not an accident. Like slavery and apartheid is it's man-made and can be removed by the actions of human beings. And I found that to be incredibly important to this discussion, right? And what I would say is that, I would take it one step further. It can be removed. And in many ways, our policymakers, the leaders that we, have our faith and trust in, are at the helm of really making these changes that are necessary. So again, I think it's an important discussion. I also think that, this is the type of thing where even with Henry Street, we can't think that we're going to make progress and then check that off our list, right? This is the type of question that continues, that needs continued analysis and commitment, because, we'll hopefully get into different ways of measuring what need is. But the reality is that $22 may be the right number now. It may not be the right number in years ahead, right? And so it's about having an openness to constantly have a laser focus on measuring what the true costs of living is in a place like New York City.
Thanks, Raysa. Well put. So maybe pivoting to Tsedeye Gebreselassie now. Today, we've heard that our labor and employment laws are still not guaranteeing New York's workers the living wages and stable jobs that they need. Can you tell us what workers in New York today are doing about it? What sorts of changes would your organization, those you work with, like to see?
Sure. Thanks, Paul. And I'm really, really happy to be here. And thank you so much to Henry Street. It really is an honor and to be with the panelists. We had a prep meeting a few weeks ago for this event, and like just hearing the people that I'd be on the panel with was like really amazing, and the work that everyone's doing. So thanks so much. In terms of why our current system is not guaranteeing New Yorkers living wage and stable jobs, I see it as, there is the pay issue, which, clearly $15 an hour is nowhere near enough. But then there are other issues that are all wrapped up into it. So there's pay, there's making sure that everybody has a right to that pay. And as Samir pointed out in his remarks, there are longstanding exclusions, some of which have been rectified, some of which have not, that are preventing everybody from receiving even, a $15 an hour minimum wage. And then there's making sure that even if you have that right, you actually do get paid. And so a lot of the work that NELP does is around this issue of enforcement and dealing with, especially in industries that pay low wages, blatant employer abuse and, wage theft. So I think I see those, at least in our work, as the factors that are really like driving this inability of so many New Yorkers to live a dignified life in the workplace and outside the workplace. In terms of the exclusions, there are, even now, restaurant tipped workers in New York only get 2/3 of the full minimum wage. And so they're forced to rely on customers giving them tips to make up the difference. Until recently, farm workers in New York were not entitled to overtime. A recent really historic campaign is going to phase out that exclusion. And violations are just rampant. A recent study found that 1/5 of New Yorkers don't even get a minimum wage or have significant minimum wage violations. And these are workers that are actually covered under the law. And because the penalties are so insufficient, and because, enforcement is so difficult because public agencies, even well-meaning ones, are just strapped, employers can take the calculated risk and, make their own cost benefit analysis and say, what, I'm better off just violating workers' rights if they so choose. And then I think the other factor that workers are fighting against, and in a moment I'll get to actually like victory, so that this is not just a litany of depressing conditions for workers, but the other factor is that we are in a system where worker voice is suppressed. We have very low unionization rates. We have a system, even though we have, the National Labor Relations Act, which was a seminal piece of legislation in the 1930s, employers have been able to manipulate it so that the Amazon win, for example, was so stunning because it managed to beat back all of the legal ways that employers can coerce and suppress and make it so difficult for workers to speak up, let alone organize into a union. So that's the context that, in addition to fighting for a higher wage, workers are fighting against. And I will say that in New York, in the last couple of years, it has been stunning the number of victories that workers have racked up. In the last couple of years, we've seen in New York City, we've seen paid sick days, which is huge. We've seen just cause employment in the fast food industry. So this is to attack a system where in this country, unlike many other countries, if you're not in a union, you can be fired. The adage is for any reason or no reason at all. So, it really prevents you from speaking up because your employer can just fire you and give you no reason. So this is, there's a movement to make sure that employers actually have to have a legitimate reason for firing you before they do so, which would be huge in terms of worker power and worker voice and pushing for things that are even beyond a minimum wage. And we've seen, ending exclusions for some tipped workers. We've seen a really amazing campaign to give worker protections to delivery app-based delivery workers, so like Uber drivers that are Grubhub type drivers that are delivering food, like a really something that is a model for other places to follow. So, and we're pretty sure that there's going to be a campaign soon to launch a new state minimum wage campaign. So to go beyond 15, hopefully up to 20 in New York City. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of headwind, but the amount of progress in the last couple of years has been really amazing.
Great, thanks today, and thanks for that. Those hopeful updates. What about if you zoom out to the national landscape? Could you just tell us in broad brush terms what that looks like, including in Congress, around our ability to get any of these needed changes?
Oh, Congress. Okay, so then now I'll go back to the well, I think the federal government has completely abdicated its responsibility to raise the minimum wage. It's been at $7.25 an hour since 2009, which is the longest stretch that it's been at one wage since it was first adopted in 1938. And I mean, everybody here knows our Congress. So that's, I think that's why states and dozens of cities now that are taking action to raise the wage floor above the feds. There are 30 states plus Washington, D.C. that have raised the minimum wage well above $7.25. About 40% of the US workforce is covered by a $15 an hour minimum wage law at this point. But we still need the federal government to act because Southern states are not one of those 30 states, and that's where a majority of Black workers live. And so the federal minimum wage is a key driver of racial inequity in the workplace. So I think, there will hopefully be some movement. It won't be enough, even in the lowest cost of living area of the country, you can't get by on $15 an hour. So, that's why I think efforts that go beyond just raising the wage floor, so efforts to really build worker power and worker voice to make it easier for workers to organize and to protect them when they speak up about violations is key.
Thanks, Tsedeye. And now finally, we'll have a chance to hear from Maura Cuffie, our last panelist. Maura, the arts have always played a vital role in New York's civic identity. Especially after the pandemic, artists are struggling more than ever to live with dignity in today's New York, threatening to drive these vital creators from our city. Can you share with us some of the innovative programs your organization is exploring to deliver economic security for artists and enabling creatives to play a vital role in building the post-pandemic New York?
I would be delighted. Thank you, Paul. I'm so motivated right now. My fellow panelists, we have so much work to do together. And I imagine a lot of the folks who have signed in for this session as well. I can't wait to continue diving into the conversation, making little notes on my sheet of paper over here for all the pieces of the puzzle. I don't know if we have them all, but I feel like a lot are here. Just to start with what you were sharing, Paul, I want to highlight that artists and culture bearers are absolutely vital, right, to New York's civic identity, and they are not separated from the lived experience of being a New Yorker, right? They're also our neighbors, their parents, caregivers. They come from all the walks of life. They face the isms that we've been talking about today, racism included, and they're workers too. And this connects to some of what you were sharing, Tsedeye. But artists, like lots of other mixed income workers, face the precarity of the gig economy, right? They navigate inconsistent money flow. Wage theft is a big thing, unfortunately, right, for arts workers, and lots of other hardships and uncertainties. So to your question, Creatives Rebuild New York is trying out some strategies, y'all. We're hoping that they're good ones. And there's little pieces that connect to everything that's been shared so far. They're definitely in direct conversation with what a living wage really means. Our applications just closed on March 25th, so we're smack dab in the middle of review and selection. The first program I'll speak briefly to is our Artist Employment Program. So this also harkens back to CETA, the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, right, which was a cool federal policy in the 70s that directly funded the employment of artists. It was in New York, it was in California, it was in a bunch of states. There's actually a really awesome exhibit at City Lore. If you're on the Lower East Side, I highly recommend it. That documents and shows the archive of what that program was. A lot of those artists who are part of that program are still here, right, and with us and doing their work here in New York City. So Creatives Rebuild New York's Artist Employment Program will employ 300 artists all across New York State. Artists in that program will be paid an annual salary of $65,000 a year for 2 years with benefits. This program is all about artists, organizations, and communities coming together to build relationship and co-determine what the work ought to be. I think this connects to Raysa, which you were talking about, the systems being designed for exploitation, right? What we're aiming to learn through the Artist Employment Program is how to put agency back in the hands, right, of those who are affected by these issues. There's a lot of nuance to that program, and I'm really excited to see what will happen. The other program, which I lead, is our Guaranteed Income for Artists. So this program will support 2,400 artists, again, all over New York State and definitely including New York City. And they'll receive $1,000 a month for 18 consecutive months, no strings attached. The eligibility for this program was really purposefully simple, and that's sort of the MO for other guaranteed income programs. Ours, you got to be an artist, of course, live in New York State, and have financial need. We were thrilled to do a lot of learning about how you understand living wage, how you understand financial need. Did some learning with FPWA, as a matter of fact, as well as the University of Washington, the folks there who developed the self-sufficiency standard, right? A more nuanced way to understand what it means to make ends meet based on your household size, what county you live in, all of these factors that spit out a wide range of numbers, especially in a complicated place like New York City. Guaranteed income, just for the fun sort of context, I imagine many folks are keyed into that work. But guaranteed income by definition is not actually about work, employment, or other labor-related responsibilities, which is key as you think about how other benefits and public assistance works, and sort of the obligations and means testing that happens there. So our program is a really different method of supporting artists than the employment program. There are loads of guaranteed income pilots all across the US, also all across the world. There's a program in Ireland right now, also supporting artists. San Francisco did a guaranteed income program for artists. There's the Bridge Project, shout out to the Bridge Project that's doing guaranteed income for mothers in New York City. It's really, and all of these projects have already demonstrated there's boatloads of evidence of the power of regular cash payments to improve well-being and financial stability. The premise is that all folks are deserving, point blank period, and that people actually know what they need. We don't need to tell them what they need to make ends meet, which I think also connects to some of what you were sharing, Raysa, about how our benefit system is broken in some ways and really not trusting of people. I think some folks see guaranteed income as an integral addition to the safety net, but not necessarily a replacement. But that's up for debate, and I'm curious how other folks see that. Creatives Rebuild New York, we're not the first to do guaranteed income, but we're excited to be doing it at a slightly larger scale. And I think there's lots we'll learn from the artists who participate in this program. And I guess just to summarize all of this, both of our programs, the underlying principle is that everyone is deserving of financial stability, right? There's probably absolutely lots of pathways to get there, right? I think even this conversation today, what is a living wage? Lots of things potentially, right? So that's part of why we're experimenting with 2 different ways of supporting artists. And also to name that it shouldn't be just the privileged few artists, right, who are supported in this way. It's really, we don't have life without culture. I guess the other theme I'd note from our two programs and what I've been hearing from our other panelists is that there needs to be some kind of shift in power. And we're attempting to demonstrate that in the way that these programs are happening, right? So for our artist employment program, artists are coming together with organizations rather than what typically happens the other way around. And likewise with our guaranteed income program, it's really about trusting artists to know what they need, right? To spend that cash the way they need it, not to say it has to be for this kind of bread or that kind of gas or this kind of debit card, but maybe it needs to be used to pay off some debt, maybe to get some supplies, maybe to, I don't know, pay for gas. There's a lot of things that are very expensive right now. I know you all know. So we're really excited about the work. I guess I'll close with just that Creative Rebuild New York. We're a short-term initiative, right? We're funded through philanthropy, and which gives us some urgency, right? To understand what we're doing, to make sense of it, to share stories, and also to find out how our work can be applicable at a larger scale. What is government's role? I think a couple of folks have said, right? And how can they adopt some of the ways we're thinking? Not because, because we got to try some more stuff.
Thank you, Maura. What really cool, exciting programs you all are building up, and they really show, the different pieces that we need to fit together to deliver living wages and self-sufficiency. Maybe touching off on the power theme that you flagged. I'm going to turn now to one of our first questions, really for the group of panelists. One of the most exciting developments in the sort of worker power, economic justice space in the past, really just the past few months, though it's been building for much longer than that, is the wave of really organic worker organizing that we're seeing in New York and across the country. It's some of the major national corporations, most significantly Starbucks and Amazon, where groups of workers, are self-organizing on the job, in some cases, supported behind the scenes with some relationships with unions, but really with workers themselves sort of driving things, and they are fighting and winning. And so I'd love to throw that up to the panelists for their, what they think, it's the significance is of this, what it means for New York, where it's going, et cetera. Anyone interested in taking a stab?
I can start very quickly. Well, I think as I said, I think this is one of the most exciting times, and certainly the most exciting time in my lifetime. And a backdrop to, I think, this conversation is to note that unionization has declined steeply over the last several decades. In the mid 1950s, 1/3 of the U.S. workforce was unionized. 1 in 3 workers, and that kind of set a pattern for much of the rest of the workforce. Today, 6% of the private sector is unionized, and only 10% total. And in New York, we've got a higher rate, but in certain states, you've got next to nothing. And so, a big part of that story has been, as we heard earlier, just vicious anti-unionism from corporate America and from the government, and a government that doesn't protect the rights of workers to organize. And so this is, I think, an incredibly inspiring development that could be the beginnings of reversing, a long history of decline. And the fact that it's percolating up from below is something that is really, I think, inspiring, and speaks to something in the air that I would close by saying that I think we got to take advantage of and run with, and try to do as much organizing as we can, because moments like this don't come often, and they don't always last forever. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Great, thanks, Samir. Now that's Tsedeye, please.
Oh, well, I was going to add quickly. I also think it's I think what's something else that's really striking about it is that, it's Amazon workers, and even if you're not a warehouse worker, the issues that they were raising as being, you know, the reasons why they organize things like surveillance and health issues, and especially in a time of COVID, like not being able to have childcare responsibilities kind of accommodated are issues that are present in lots of different workplaces. And so I think that I feel like this is a way to kind of like expand the thinking about, well, maybe I should be in a union too, broader than just a warehouse, you know, than like just the warehouse industry or other industries that pay lower wages. And so I think if you see like the unions, the organizing that's also happening in, you know, like newsrooms and just across our economy, I think is really, really exciting.
And
Well put today. Oh, please, Maura, please.
We're so
Yeah.
excited, Paul. We just can't, can't stop. I was just thinking on the, yeah, it is an exciting time for sure. And what came to mind for me is if we're thinking about a resurgence of worker activism, so many artists right now are thinking about what is a solidarity economy. I'm seeing people talk about it everywhere. What is it? What does worker ownership mean in the context, in many contexts, not just one context, right? And there's really cool work being done by folks at Art.coop, US Federation of Worker Cooperatives. We're all thinking about cultural power in relationship to that kind of activism. So just to add to the other things we're seeing.
Great point, and just to some of the sectors that we've been talking about that need living wages. I mean, there's actually the art sector and the human services sector. There's been really a wave of unionization in those sectors as well that we're seeing, as well as the media business. You know, kind of really many of New York's major industries are seeing this renewed wave of unionization, which is really exciting and important. Maybe just one more of our prepared questions, then we can pivot. We have some good questions from the audience, but you know, right now we're struggling with this already unaffordable city. Now, you know, for the highest inflation in 40 years, you know, rents are going through the roof again, and you know, we've talked about some of the you know, kind of, we need living wages, we need government benefits. Are there other responses that speak more to kind of affordability on the cost side that need to be part of the solution that any of your organizations are working on or that you're familiar with? You know, for example, there seems like there's a new way, a new push nationally around rent controls or kind of just cause protections for eviction. You know, and something that, you know, maybe 30 years ago, you know, was kind of in, you know, kind of there really wasn't a movement around, and just that partly because of the housing affordability, you know, crisis nationally has gotten so bad. Is there anything that, you know, you all would flag for us around controlling costs for working families in New York or elsewhere?
I mean, I can jump in a little bit here. I mean, I think it speaks to a lot of what I mentioned before, right? I think 22 absolutely is an important, significant step. We need to be committed to just continued like assessment of what the true cost of living is. And we need to also just be committed to like a range of worker supports. And so, yes, it's childcare. Yes, it's housing vouchers. Yes, it's, you know, what we know are important tax tools as well, right? And so I think it's both. It's both the raising the wage and making sure that the worker supports are also in place.
Great. Well, with that, why don't we pivot to the questions? We have a bunch of good questions that have come in. So I'll flag some of them, and if any, maybe I'll share them for the panelists, and if folks have thoughts, please share them, or I can tackle some of them too. So the first one is actually kind of a question about, I guess, casualization of work. You know, this is obviously a big issue both in the low-paying service jobs, but also in the art sector and a lot of kind of in media and others. So you know, we have the growth of the kind of gig economy. where workers aren't guaranteed basic minimum wage or basic labor standards. And then the questioner is asking about freelancers who also assume kind of economic risk and don't have a guaranteed salary. And can any of our panelists speak to these dynamics, the kind of exploitation that's possible, that is often occurs when workers don't have that kind of stable protection of employment protections, and what we should do about it?
I mean, the little bit I can add is I think there's more to be done in the field of guaranteed income, right? Like, what a different world it would feel like if we all had sort of a basic sort of regular payment coming our way, particularly for folks who experience lots of gaps, right? And the times where they are contracted, where they are getting that cash in the mix. The child tax credit, right, is actually a good example of how that kind of policy could happen in real terms with real people all the time. I think that that's also part of why, at least in the arts, why so many artists and arts workers are asking really different questions with their employers. It's why you see, like in the Philadelphia Museum of our workers trying to unionize, why you've seen what's been going on at MoMA, et cetera, because of exactly the dynamics of the question that you're posing. So not an answer, but I think one pathway that we should continue to explore and continue to seek funding for is guaranteed income work and basic income work.
Yeah, great point. I should flag, New York has started to adopt some protections. I mean, on the one hand, for gig workers, there's which is for example, rideshare drivers, with gas prices going up, they're being slammed nationally because they pay out of their own pockets all their expenses. But one of the few places where that's less true is New York, which actually adopted minimum compensation standards for Uber drivers, and so they're protected more. I mean, they still have to update them in light of the higher gas prices, but that's a place, and New York then similarly is in the course of adopting minimum labor standards for gig delivery workers, and then for freelancers more in the arts or kind of media and other sectors. New York adopted the freelance isn't free law a number of years ago, which basically provides fair payment protections and other standard contracts and the like to help as a first step towards protecting freelancers from being exploited. But there's much more still to be done. Samir, were you?
I would just add on this, maybe on the sort of historical dimension. It's what we're seeing with the app economy and casualization resulting from that is clearly new. But this idea that some people are workers and some people aren't workers is an old one. And that, takes us back to the exclusions from the original labor protections. Farm workers aren't real workers, so they are not entitled to basic protections. And the logic behind that is not just to demean someone and say you're not a worker, but to enable Southern planters to be able to exploit their farm workers more by preventing them from accessing the basic rights that everyone else had. And so I think we always need to understand this effort to remove people from the classification of a worker, whether it's through subcontracting or whatever else, is a mechanism that the ruling class, that employers have long relied upon to create more vulnerable and exploitable pools of workers. And just last on that, the punchline though is that, of course, everyone who works is a worker, and there's power in that. And what we're seeing from Amazon workers and everyone else, Starbucks, who are organizing from below, that tells us that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether you're called a worker or not. At a certain point, it matters quite a lot in a lot of ways, but there's still power in organizing and fighting, however you're classified.
Yeah, no, well put. Actually, a story in that vein that kind of comes to mind is around the campaign that Tsedeye flagged around just cause employment protections and reining in at will. Some of the workers in New York City who've been fighting for that most vocally are really illustrate the needs of workers, across the spectrum. It's been, on the one hand, fast food workers, exploited low-wage service workers, but then also journalists at major media companies have been fighting, because basically the media world had been fighting to make against just cause employment protections, and many of them are actually unionized, but was fighting to have free reign in firing them. And the journalists who have been so buffeted by the kind of the turmoil in the media business, fought back hard, and they were able to push back and hold on to just cause protection. So it really, I think, highlights the kind of common needs that workers at a variety of income levels really have. Maybe the next question is sort of an interesting one. It's raising the question: is the assumption of the aspiration to a 40-hour work week, is that actually still realistic? Or really, should our work week be less than 40, which is a kind of a growing movement you're seeing more, as a corporate practice. There are more companies that are shifting to a 4-day work week with, I think in many cases, some cases 40 hours squeezed into 4 days, some cases, working fewer than 40 hours. But would anyone like to speak to that?
I can start. I mean, it's interesting. The 40-hour work week was, it's like after 40 hours, you get time and a half if you work more. Like that's kind of how it came about. I don't think it came about in like a 40 hours as the optimal number of hours to work. I think it was more like a pushback against capital being like, well, 100 hours a week is the optimal hours to work. And so the pushback was, okay, well, but you have to pay us a time and a half after 40, So I think that there is movement around this. There have been bills introduced in Congress by, lefty allies to do a 32-hour work week. And I think, COVID, but even before COVID, I mean, if you have schools that are open from 9 to 3, I mean, forget about not having adequate childcare for even the 9 to 3 hours, but it just does not compute, right? Like mathematically how you can make 40 hours a week work. And so I think this is also part of what's a dignified workplace. It's less hours, maybe it's more control over your schedule. It shouldn't just be people that can work in front of a computer that can, choose when they're going to work during the day. So I think it's all part of a package of like giving workers more control over how they work, which we can actually do in many more industries than we say we can.
Yeah, great point. Anyone else? Or maybe I'll go to, oh, please.
Yeah, no, just thinking about the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, right? That federal policy I was mentioning before. They called it a 3-2 model for artists. So the idea was you would spend 3 days of your week, right, working with an organization, and 2 of those days of that 5-day work week would be reserved for your own artistic practice. And that's an interesting model for a lot of reasons. For our artist employment program and for the guaranteed income program as well, we convened a think tank of artists and scholars and policy people to sort of set the overall direction and the guidelines for the design for both programs. And what we heard from all of those folks, whether they were artists or academics or, wherever they were in the field, was that more, like you were saying today, like more agency overall in how work happens. So where we landed for the artist employment program is that, yes, it's a salary, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're at a desk 8 hours a day and somehow fitting your art practice into it. So in fact, part of that application program was for an artist and organization or multiple artists, multiple organizations who are collaborating to talk through together what that looks like for them, right? Is it that 6 months of the year, right? We're in the office doing community projects together, and maybe another 6 months, something different is happening. So I think we're going to get a wide range of other possibilities for how what working, right, actually looks like for that program.
sort of in a related question, someone is asking in the chat, is there a conversation about job sharing in the United States? And the questioner said that I guess Sweden has had such policies for some time. Is anyone familiar with that? I'm only familiar with it in the limited, there's a context around avoiding layoffs. There's a policy that organizations like NELP promote to encourage companies to, rather than laying off workers, you can reduce your workforce to partial hours, and the workers whose hours are cut to part-time can collect unemployment, partial unemployment benefits for the lost hours. So it's a way to avoid layoffs. So that's sort of a limited tool during recessions, but which is a good policy, and generally employers, many employers like it. But are there other kind of work sharing conversations that others are familiar with in the United States? No. Okay. Well, maybe moving to another question. So someone asks about profit sharing. Is there a place for pushing greater profit sharing with frontline workers or across the workforce as a strategy for fairness and boosting incomes? Anyone? You were mentioning the kind of co-op movement more. That's sort of a different solidarity model. But anything? One thing I would flag that or today, were you going to say?
No, go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, maybe you might have been thinking the same thing. So there's something that we have been promoting around raising the minimum wage, but in adjusting it each year. Typically, it's been adjusted to keep up with rising consumer prices, the rising cost of living. But actually, the Hochul administration did something innovative last year when they adjusted the upstate minimum wage, which is still phasing up to 15. They adjusted it to take into account both keep up with rising prices and to reflect the recent, over the past year, growth in worker productivity. So it's sort of like akin to a form of profit sharing. It's a way of trying to ensure that when firm and worker productivity increase, that workers share some of the benefits of that in the form of a higher minimum wage. And that's a model that we're advocating and think that New York should adopt across the board for its minimum wage.
And I think this is not profit sharing, but in a similar vein, like there is movement or just advocacy to rein in stock buybacks, that corporations do. So they'll before with all their excess profits, companies used to invest a little bit more in raising workers' wages or improving benefits, whatever, and now they just use it to buy back stocks and distribute them to their shareholders. So basically, workers are not seeing the gains of like the profits that their work is realizing for the companies. So I think there's been more focus on just highlighting that as like yet another way that capital is making things worse for workers. But I'm not familiar of like any like policy movements around that, but just there's a lot of discussion around it.
Actually, I don't know if folks saw the news clips about how Starbucks, that like most big corporations, is plowing tons of money into buybacks because they, reduces their stock value, has with now facing what they view as the emergency of worker organizing, is cutting them in order to invest in higher pay and benefits in an effort to stave off more unionization. So that was kind of it.
Oh, I did not really see that. That's awesome.
Yeah. So there's another question about tax policy, about how that intersects with, we've been talking mostly about labor standards, about benefits, about other things like that. How does tax policy fit in, both, I guess, kind of personal tax, there's the earned income tax credit, but also corporate tax policy? Are there incentives, tax incentives for better jobs, or that have been proposed or that should be adopted? Is anyone familiar with options in that realm? And I think what you were just alluding to.
I can't speak to broader tax policy, but I can speak to, what are crucial tax credits for working families, right? And so I think that's an important part of the discussion. And during the time of recovery, the child tax credit, the refundable child tax credit that was available to households with children was a lifeline. And unfortunately, that needed to be permanent. It still needs to be permanent. It needs to be part of like the long-term advocacy. We know the data shows us that it's an important tool in reducing child poverty. And so, that and the earned income tax credit are important pieces of the solution as well.
And something I'd flag also about thank you, Raysa, but the earned income tax credit, one of the key roles, I think we mentioned it's a key complement to a living wage, because neither by itself is adequate to get kind of workers or families up to an adequate level. You need both of them, but in particular, the earned income tax credit and other tax credits can help adjust the income picture by family size, because it's not really that practical to have families of different sizes, families with more dependents obviously need higher income, but it's not that practical to have a minimum wage that varies by family size, or to have companies offer different salaries for workers doing the same jobs based on their family size. So that's really where the earned income tax credit and other tax credits come in. They give you a larger boost if you have more dependents or a larger family, and that's a way of adjusting an income to meet family size needs.
I'll maybe jump in on this, just maybe to take a step from what's in the current policy discourse, and maybe like where the imagination could be on trying to bring. I think the profits, the taxes, and the costs question can all be thought of together. We're living through the most rapid price increases in 40 years. We're also living through some of the fastest profit growth in a long time as well. And in the past, there have been times where prices have been just controlled across all categories, not just rent. I mean, wartime, the World War II is a classic example of this, but it was also, those price controls were accompanied by what were called excess profit taxes. And the idea of excess profits, just that idea that there is such a thing as an excess profit that is above and beyond what is reasonable for a business's internal health, that they don't need this for reinvestment into whatever they're doing. This is just excess. And a complement of tools like that, excess profit taxes, controls on what businesses can charge for vital goods that we all need, would go a long way towards controlling costs that we're facing. And costs are, of course, the other side of the coin on the living wage, right? It's the wage only really takes meaning in relation to costs. And thinking about the question of costs ultimately requires us to confront the issue of profits, and that this is not necessarily a zero-sum game, but there are some people who win and others who lose, and it's about contesting for the share of what working people produce.
Great point, Samir. And I maybe flag that there's now kind of more activist leadership at the Federal Trade Commission, for example, and they are kind of tackling really kind of price gouging and a variety of exploitative consumer practices. There's also sort of in a similar vein, an important package that was introduced in the New York legislature to toughen New York's antitrust laws to facilitate, stronger antitrust enforcement, there's also kind of a renewed recognition that, antitrust is a key tool for protecting not just consumers, but actually workers and just kind of fairness in the economy. So, and it's, it's not really, you can't pass hardly anything in Congress, so it's not practical to make those changes at the federal level. But if New York's toughens its antitrust laws, there's a lot that the Attorney General and others here can do. Well, I think we're really, coming to a close. So this has been really a really rich panel, and I know we haven't quite been able to make it to all of our questions, but it's really, I've really enjoyed it and learned a lot from the panelists this evening. So I guess I think we're going to wrap up now. I guess I'd like to ask everyone to join me in thanking our incredible panelists and our hosts at Henry Street for this really wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much, panelists, and to our moderator. I learned so much from you tonight, and thank you to everyone who was tuning in. And again, as Paul just said, we had so many good questions in the chat, and there's such an interesting conversation going on in the chat. So I hope you all will look at your programs, to look at the book lists that I put together with recommendations for how to continue to engage in this topic. And stay connected with Henry Street Settlement. If you go to our website at henrystreet.org and follow us on social media, we would love for you to come visit. I work at Henry Street as a public historian, and I'd be happy to give you a tour of Henry Street's headquarters and our history exhibit. And you can stay in touch for future history programming and other programming at Henry Street. So thank you all so much, and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
And thank you so much to our interpreters tonight as well.
Thank you,
Really
guys.
appreciate your efforts.
Thanks so much, everyone. Good night.
Bye, everyone.